Welcome to the first ever Ancient DOS Games Pro video, where we take a look back at a previously reviewed game and dive into a specific aspect of it, analyzing said aspect in extreme detail to find out how it works and how it can be used to a player's advantage. To kick things off, we're going to be taking a look at the stat balancing in One Must Fall 2097. Arguably one of the best fighting games ever made, but perhaps the absolute best fighting game exclusively made for DOS. But every time I go back to play this game, something always feels odd. Like that it's taking far too much effort to whittle down the health bars of my opponents, or that they're somehow defeating me faster than anticipated or possible. Unfortunately, OMF gives us an interesting glimpse into how the underlying calculations may be taking place through its stat system. Now, every fighter in the game has three primary stats: power, agility, and endurance, respectively affecting how much damage they do to opponents, how fast they move, and how much damage is prevented when suffering a hit, though endurance also has a secondary effect on how easily a character gets stunned. The question we're going to try to answer today is quite simple. Which stat is better? Or is it better to have a mix, or to focus on a specific stat? Now, part of the reason we need to ask this question is because OMF treats these stats as point-for-point equivalent. In the special tournament mode, you build a character up over the course of various tournaments, spending money on improving these primary stats, and the cost to improve them is identical for every stat. Furthermore, when you adjust these stats in the single or multiplayer modes, they're swapped around point for point, so the game is clearly trying to indicate that these stats are equivalent in some way. So we're going to test that. However, before we get started, I want to draw your attention to the game's settings, because this is going to be important in making sure our experimenting goes smoothly. First of all, I've disabled the stage hazards. This way, it doesn't matter which stage we do our testing on, we won't have to worry about the hazards throwing anything out of whack. Secondly, since we're going to be using the two-player mode, these two sliders are very important as they affect how much damage each player does. And it's actually impossible to exactly match this up to the amount of damage you would do in the single-player mode, but the default values you see here are close enough, so I'm just going to leave them as it is. Another important thing to note, and the reason why we're doing this in two-player mode and not in single-player or tournament, is that the skill level plays a factor in the stats of your opponents, and we have no good way to measure how much of an effect it actually has. The last thing I want to point out is there's a hidden advanced options screen, which you access by holding down the 2, 0, 9, and 7 keys simultaneously on the main menu, and then going into the options. Note that you need a decent keyboard to be able to hold all 4 of those keys at once without any of them being missed. Now, the most common advanced option OMF players like to turn on is re-hit mode, which enables a sort of juggling similar to what you would see in contemporary fighting games, though not quite the same, as you'll break a juggle if you try to hit with the exact same move twice in a row. Now, this isn't a huge factor to our testing, but I wanted to point out that it's enabled and that all the other advanced options are set to default. Okay, let's actually get to it. But first you might be wondering how we're going to test these stats when we only have 10 fighters to choose from. Well, there's yet another secret feature that's going to help us here. By moving your selection cursor over every fighter at least once and holding down the kick button afterwards, a little highlight will pop up on your stats, allowing you to use your movement keys to adjust the stats however you want, though it'll always stay balanced to the same quantity of stat points. Which raises an interesting question. Does every fighter have the same number of stat points, or do some fighters have more total stat points than others? I decided to figure this out by simply maxing out each fighter's power level and seeing how many points were left to go into agility. If they're properly balanced, every fighter's agility should be the same after doing this. Except they were not the same. 6 of the 10 fighters do indeed have the same number of stat points. Crystal, Stefan, Jean-Paul, Angel, Cassette, and Raven, who appear to have 30 stat points each, which I figured out through a bit of manipulation that each stat bar ranges from 0 to 20 points. However, Christian, Milano, and Ibrahim each have 1 extra stat point at 31, while Shiro got the short end of the stick and only has 29 stat points in total. So if you're playing without altering your stats, it would almost seem like Christian, Milano, and Ibrahim would be your best bets, right? Well, hold the phone, we still need to figure out if the stats themselves are balanced with each other. So here's how we're going to test that. We're going to start with comparing power and endurance. On screen in a moment, you're going to see 2 battles take place side by side. On the right, my character will have maximum power and will be attacking a fighter with maximum endurance using light kicks. while on the left, my character will have 0 power, but will also be attacking a fighter with 0 endurance, again using light kicks. I'll also be using the same bots in both cases, as I imagine that might affect things too. Now, if power and endurance are perfectly balanced with each other, then both battles should end in the exact same number of hits, which they do not. When using full power against full endurance, it took 10 hits to take down the opponent, but when using 0 power against 0 endurance, it took 11 hits. Well, let's actually perform a spectrum of values here to see how it all holds up. This time split between 0, 5, 10, 15, and 20 power for the attacker, and the same values for the defender's endurance. Let's just see if there's any anomalies here. Curiously, they all balance out with each other at 10 hits, except for the 0 power versus 0 endurance, which is 11. Though an additional thing to note is that stun resistance didn't seem to be related to the damage dealt, and was primarily related to the endurance stat alone. So if we went just by that, it would seem having more endurance is actually more advantageous. Now, just out of curiosity, let's do a couple more spectrum tests to gauge how linear this all is. First, we're going to adjust the attacker's power between 0, 5, 10, 15, and 20, but the defender will have 0 endurance in all circumstances. The result is interesting. At 0 power, it took 11 light kicks to take out our opponent, then 9 hits for 5 power, 7 hits for 10 power, yet it still took 7 hits for 15 power, and it took only 1 hit less at 6 hits for 20 power. This tends to suggest there's not much of an advantage going for excessive amounts of power unless the opponent also has high endurance to match. This does, however, suggest that the amount of damage being dealt is a linear increase relative to a base value, and sort of suggests that 20 power might be exactly twice as strong as 0 power. So we'll do another spectrum test. This time we'll have 0 power in each circumstance, but the opponent will go from 0 to 5, 10, 15, and ultimately 20 endurance. Now, unlike the power stat spectrum, this one should be perfectly linear if the increase in defense is also linear. And sure enough, we actually see a perfectly linear result, starting with 11 hits and increasing by 2 each step of the way up to 19 hits. Again, sort of suggesting that 20 points of endurance may equate to twice as good as 0 endurance. However, the tournament mode shows that the HARs themselves have stat points, yet in the single and 2-player modes, whatever these stats are, we can't adjust them. So these might be playing a factor, and they might be different for every bot. So let's test some 0 power light kicks from the Jaguar against all 10 robots, with Ibrahim as the pilot of each defending bot, as he has maximum endurance by default. Now, if the bot itself is an influence on defense, then the results here should not be equal. And indeed, they are not. The Shadow, Electra, and Gargoyle each went down the fastest at 18 hits, while the Pyros beat all of them out with 21 hits being how much it took. I also decided to quickly look up each robot's stats in tournament mode to see if they matched up with these results in any way, yet curiously, they don't. And for instance, the Jaguar, the HAR I'm best with and use most of the time in tournament mode, maxes out at 6 armor units and managed to survive 19 hits during the test just now. Yet as we see here, the Shadow maxes out at 8 armor units, yet only survived 18 hits in our test. If it's supposed to have more armor, why did it survive fewer hits? Well, we don't have an easy way to answer that question, so instead, let's turn our attention to the agility stat, which we haven't factored into this equation yet. The first thing to demonstrate, though, is that agility not only affects movement speed, but it also affects both jump height and jump speed. If we compare Milano, who has maximum agility, beside Ibrahim, who has only 1 point of agility, and turn the game speed down to see the results more clearly, we see that if both characters jump simultaneously, Milano not only reaches the highest jump height, but also touches the ground again sooner. So they jump both higher and faster, which can be a pro or a con depending on your approach to combat. This also affects the super jump, which you perform by pressing down immediately before jumping, but the end result is the same. High agility means you jump the highest, but also complete your jump the fastest. Next, let's get an idea of just how big a difference agility makes in terms of movement speed, by timing how long it takes to get from one side of the arena to the other, and overlaying 3 different results over top of each other. The red Jaguar has 0 agility, the yellow Jaguar has 10, and the blue Jaguar has 20. Yeah, that goes by pretty quick, but they were almost synced linearly. It took the red Jaguar about 3.6 seconds and the blue Jaguar exactly half of that at 1.8 seconds. However, the yellow Jaguar only took 2 1/3 1/3 seconds, whereas if this was strictly linear, it should have taken 2.7 seconds. Although given the way the game handles the frame rate and movement rates at varying game speeds, this could be a granularity issue, as in the math being performed may not be accurate enough to account precisely for these changes. The granularity could also explain some of the earlier tests with power and endurance, except that the game does indeed keep track of sub-pixels of health, so granularity shouldn't be an issue. Each robot has 100 hit points, and in fact, the health bars themselves are exactly 101 pixels long, taking into account that the health bars are designed with a 3D bezel effect. So to ensure one hit point is clearly differentiated from 0 hit points, one hit point actually shows up as 2 pixels long, whereas 0 hit points doesn't render the health bar at all. To further complicate this, subpixels are always rounded up. So if you had 99.1 hit points, it would still show up as 100 hit points. You have to be right at 0 to see 0 hit points, which is why any special attack is guaranteed to knock out an opponent at 0 hit points, even if they're blocking, as blocking a special attack always results in sub-units of damage, whereas blocking a regular attack does 0 damage by default. Though again, that can be changed with the advanced options. Now, I wanted to compare the rate of attack next, but I discovered something somewhat disturbing. The player's agility stat has virtually no effect on attack speed. On the left is a character with 0 agility, and on the right is a character with 20 agility. Both have the same HAR, and both are doing roundhouse kicks, yet both manage to get off the same number of kicks in the same amount of time, with the character at 20 agility only being extremely slightly faster by a tiny fraction of a second, and that could just simply be down to idle frames between attacks being faster. What this means is that no matter what agility you give to your fighter, their attacks follow through at the same speed. So agility doesn't help at all in terms of getting you ready to block sooner following an attack, nor does it give you much advantage in terms of jumping over an attack, as there's only a very small difference in jump height and speed between 0 and max agility. And furthermore, every point of agility you have detracts from your other stats, which could be adding to your survivability or your ability to dish out damage. That said, HARs in the tournament mode do have upgrades available for increasing the speed of their 2 attack types, typically punches and kicks, though this varies depending on the bot, as the Pyros has flame cannons instead of legs, and the Flail has its flails instead, so it's still very possible to have really fast or really slow attacks in the tournament mode, but because of the complexities of it, I wanted to instead focus on the main and single and 2-player modes here. So, after all of its investigating, what have we determined? Well, we figured out a bunch of useful tidbits. In the single and 2-player modes, each stat can range from 0 to 20 points. Christian, Milano, and Ibrahim are the best picks if you're modifying your stat points, with Shiro being the worst. Power and endurance are roughly equivalent to each other, except endurance has the added benefit of increased stun resistance. Having maximum points in a particular stat equates to roughly double the effectiveness of having 0 points. The HARs in the single and 2-player modes have varying preset stats, which do not relate to their tournament mode stats. Jumps are both higher and completed faster with higher agility. And finally, agility has no effect on attack speed, only movement speed, jump speed, and idle animation frames. Now to put this information to practice, I tried playing a run with my usual stats of maxed agility and then twice as much power as endurance, and it went about as well as usual, in that it was pretty random how well I was doing the whole way through. But then I tried a couple runs with 0 agility and mostly even power and endurance, and found that despite everything feeling sluggish, I was actually able to fight surprisingly well, mostly because I wasn't getting slaughtered by lucky combos from the AI, and wasn't getting stunned nearly as often as I'm used to. Not to mention all my usual combos still worked out fine because the attack speed isn't affected. But it did still feel sluggish, so now that I know that endurance has some seeming advantages over power, and that it doesn't take a lot of power to counter the effects of endurance, I decided to try a run having both high agility and endurance with a few points thrown into power, and found that to be surprisingly easier for me to handle than I'm used to. So that's probably the way I'm going to do it from now on. So yes, agility does still have a bit of usefulness in that you can not only position yourself better, but any kind of jump attack can be performed from further away and will hit faster. Plus it's easier to chain combos from jump attacks since the maximum time between connecting and landing to perform another attack is also shorter. So agility is still a point of preference, but there's very little difference in feel between max agility and high agility. whereas those same stat points could make a big difference when used as power endurance. So the one recommendation I can make to all non-expert OMF players, if you're having trouble, try reducing your agility a little and moving those points into other stats, with an emphasis on more endurance before more power. Now for the experts, I would recommend fiddling with agility first and foremost, since it has no effect on the actual attacks you perform, and see how low you can get it before it affects your ability to fight, then distribute those remaining points into your other stats, remembering that excessive power is only useful against opponents with high endurance, and otherwise has only a minor effect on how many hits you'll need to land to win, just by nature of how the math works. Anywho, that's all for the first ADG Pro video. Hopefully you all found it entertaining and interesting. Future ADG Pro videos will pretty much be like this one, where we delve into various aspects of games and pick them apart. So if you have any thoughts on what aspects of a specific game you'd like to see investigated, feel free to email those suggestions to adg@pixelships.com. And make sure to let me know in the comments if you enjoy this format or not, or if you have any ideas as to how to improve it or make it even more interesting. As for next Saturday, we'll be seeing our first ADG mod video ever, and we're going to be starting that sub-series off with a lesson on how to make levels for a particular first-person shooter virtually everyone knows and loves, as well as touching briefly on how to edit other aspects of the game. So make sure to stay tuned if you want to learn some level editing tricks. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random set of you guys.